The sound of a roof collapsing under 30 tons of solid ice doesn't snap, it screams. It sounds like the twisting, tearing scream of a dying giant. When the great whiteout of 2024 erased the remote mountain town of Blackwood Peak from the map, 42 homes were flattened into splinters in a single terrifying night. Only one structure remained standing when the rescue helicopters finally broke through the clouds a week later. It belonged to a woman the entire town had mocked isolated and called a lunatic. They laughed at her ugly, over-engineered stone shield for months, but when the sky fell, that shield was the only thing standing between life and a freezing, crushing death. Abigail Foster did not move to the isolated, high-altitude community of Crest Haven, Colorado, to make friends. At 62, the retired commercial structural engineer had spent her entire life calculating load-bearing walls for skyscrapers in Chicago. She knew how much weight a steel I-beam could take before it sheared, and she knew exactly what happened when people ignored the math. She had come to Crest Haven for the silence, purchasing a modest 1970s A-frame cabin perched on a rocky outcropping at an elevation of 9,400 feet. It was idyllic, surrounded by towering lodgepole pines and offering a breathtaking view of the valley below. But Abigail couldn't just look at a beautiful view without looking at the vulnerabilities. Her first week in the cabin, she climbed onto the roof with a tape measure level and a notebook. She studied the wooden trusses, the age of the asphalt shingles, and the pitch of the roofline. Then she spent 3 weeks analyzing a century's worth of meteorological data for the region. She noticed a terrifying, overlooked trend. Every 60 to 70 years, a specific convergence of pressure systems off the Pacific coast created a localized anomaly over the Crest Haven Valley, a stationary atmospheric river that dumped heavy, wet concrete snow at rates that defied modern building codes. The last one had hit in 1954, burying the valley under 12 feet of ice and crushing a logging camp. According to her calculations, they were overdue. The changing global climate patterns were only going to act as an accelerant. By late August, while the rest of the town was enjoying the late summer breeze and preparing for the upcoming hunting season, Abigail began to build. She didn't just reinforce her roof, she built a shield over it. She hired a flatbed truck from Denver to deliver tons of high-tensile steel girders and hundreds of heavy-gauge wire gabion baskets. She spent her retirement savings hiring an out-of-town crane operator to erect a massive secondary A-frame structure directly over her cabin, anchored into the granite bedrock with 6-foot steel pylons. But she didn't stop at steel. Once the frame was up, she filled the wire gabion baskets with thousands of pounds of smooth river stones, creating a thick, angled carapace of rock suspended 3 feet above her actual wooden roof. It was an architectural monstrosity. It looked like a medieval bunker had been dropped on top of a quaint mountain lodge, and the town of Crest Haven hated it. Thomas Miller, the owner of the local hardware store and the unofficial mayor of the community, was the first to confront her. Miller was a man who prided himself on knowing everything about mountain living. He had lived in Crest Haven for 40 years and had a deep, stubborn belief that anything he hadn't personally experienced simply wasn't possible. "You're driving down the property values, Ms. Foster," Miller told her one afternoon, leaning out of the window of his Ford F-250 as she supervised the crane lowering a basket of rocks onto the steel frame. "People come up here for the rustic aesthetic, not to look at a military installation. What do you think you're protecting yourself from an airstrike?" Hydrostatic pressure and dead load, Mr. Miller. Abigail replied evenly, not taking her eyes off the crane. "The building code here only requires roofs to withstand 60 pounds per square foot of snow load. When the convergence happens, we are going to see upwards of 200 pounds per square foot. Every wooden roof in this valley will fail." Miller laughed loudly, a booming sound that echoed off the pines. Convergence. I've survived blizzards here since before you were drawing blueprints in a comfortable city office. We get snow. We shovel it. We drink hot toddies. That pile of rocks is going to collapse on your head the first time the wind blows. The sentiment spread through the town like a virus. Henry Sloan, a local contractor who had built half the cabins in the valley, made it a point to mock Abigail at the local diner. He sketched crude drawings on napkins of her stone shield crushing her cabin and passed them around to roaring laughter. Margaret Cole, the town gossip, started a petition to have the county inspector condemn the structure, claiming it was an unpermitted eyesore. The inspector did come. A weary-looking man named Alfred Davies. He spent 3 hours going over her blueprints and inspecting the welds. When he finally emerged, he looked at Abigail with a mixture of bewilderment and profound respect. Technically, Alfred muttered, adjusting his glasses, it's not attached to the primary dwelling, so it counts as a freestanding shelter canopy. I can't cite you for it. But Abigail, this thing could take a direct hit from a freight train. What are you expecting? The sky to fall, Alfred. Abigail said simply, and I'd suggest you check the joists on your own house before December. The town's ridicule eventually turned into passive-aggressive isolation. When Abigail went to Miller's hardware store to buy heavy-duty winter weather stripping and high-capacity propane tanks, the clerks ignored her. Her neighbors, the Hendersons, planted a row of fast-growing Leyland cypress trees directly on the property line so they wouldn't have to look at the stone shield. Abigail didn't care. As September turned into October, she finished the installation. The shield was complete, a massive angled roof of steel and riverstone that cast a heavy shadow over her home. She installed a high-efficiency wood stove, stockpiled 3 cords of seasoned oak, and wired a backup generator to a buried 1,000-gallon diesel tank. She canned vegetables, stockpiled medical supplies, and waited. They called her a paranoid fool. They called her Cabin Foster's Folly. But Abigail knew something they didn't. Math doesn't care about human pride. Math doesn't care about mountain traditions. And the math said a monster was coming. The signs began in the second week of November, exactly as Abigail's models had predicted. But they were subtle at first, masked by the normal transition into winter. It started with the barometric pressure. Abigail had a vintage maritime brass barometer mounted in her living room, alongside modern digital weather stations. On a Tuesday morning, the needle dropped so fast, she initially thought the instrument was broken. The digital readouts confirmed it. The atmospheric pressure was plunging at an unprecedented rate, a phenomenon meteorologists call bombogenesis, or a bomb cyclone. But this wasn't just a standard winter storm. A massive, slow-moving low-pressure system from the Gulf of Alaska had stalled directly over the Rockies, and a superheated atmospheric river from the Pacific was feeding endless moisture into it. In town, nobody noticed the invisible weight pressing down on the valley. They only noticed the unseasonably warm afternoon. It was 45 degrees balmy for November in Crest Haven. Henry Sloan was out in his shirt sleeves chopping firewood and laughing with his sons. Thomas Miller had organized a pre-winter barbecue in the town square. Abigail stood on her reinforced porch, looking up at the sky. It wasn't blue. It was a sickly bruised purple, like a massive hematoma spreading across the horizon. The air felt heavy, almost greasy, and it was completely dead. Not a single bird was singing. The mule deer that usually grazed on the edge of her property were gone, having fled to lower elevations days ago. Even the wind, a constant companion at 9,400 feet, had completely stopped. The silence was deafening. She walked back inside, secured the heavy deadbolts on her solid oak door, and began to execute her final checklist. She pulled the heavy insulated storm shutters closed over her triple-paned windows, locking them into place with steel crossbars. She bled the air from her radiator lines, checked the voltage on her deep-cycle battery bank, and brought the last of her firewood indoors. At 4 p.m., the local radio station broadcasted a standard winter weather advisory. Expect heavy snowfall tonight into tomorrow. Residents are advised to limit travel. It was a gross, fatal understatement. By 6 p.m., the temperature plummeted from 45 degrees to 0 in less than 20 minutes. The sudden, violent drop caused the moisture in the air to flash freeze. It didn't start snowing. It started raining shards of ice. The sound of the ice hitting Abigail's stone shield was like a million ball bearings being dropped onto a tin roof. Down in the valley, the sudden freeze caught the town completely off guard. Thomas Miller's barbecue ended in chaos as the ice storm shattered windshields and coated the roads in a thick, frictionless glaze. Power lines, immediately heavy with ice, began to snap under the sudden tension. At 6:45 p.m., the power grid in Crest Haven failed. A blue-green flash illuminated the darkening sky as the main substation transformer blew, plunging the valley into absolute darkness. Inside her cabin, Abigail's lights flickered once before her automatic transfer switch kicked in. The low, steady hum of her diesel generator vibrated through the floorboards. She was an island of light in a sea of black. Then, the true storm arrived. The wind didn't build gradually. It slammed into the mountainside with hurricane force. The anemometer on Abigail's roof clocked a gust at 92 miles per hour before the instrument was violently torn from its mounting. The sound of the wind was a continuous, deafening roar, a physical force that made the ground tremble. And then came the snow. But it wasn't the light, fluffy powder Colorado was famous for. Due to the bizarre atmospheric collision, it was Sierra cement, dense, heavy, moisture-laden snow that weighed close to 20 pounds per cubic foot, and it was falling at a rate of 4 inches an hour. Inside her cabin, Abigail sat in her armchair, a cup of black coffee in her hands, listening to the terrifying symphony above her. She could hear the wind howling, trying to find a purchase on her home. But the stone shield was doing exactly what she designed it to do. The aerodynamic pitch of the rock-filled gabion baskets deflected the worst of the wind, acting like the armor of an armadillo. But the true test was the weight. By midnight, 3 feet of concrete snow had fallen. Down in the town, the reality of the situation was beginning to set in. Without power, the central heating systems in the modern cabins were useless. The residents huddled around their decorative fireplaces, listening to their wooden roofs begin to groan under the rapidly accumulating dead weight. Henry Sloan, the contractor who had mocked Abigail, stood in his living room with a flashlight shining the beam up at his vaulted ceiling. He had built it himself using standard 2x10 rafters. He heard a sharp cracking sound, like a rifle shot echoing from the attic space. His heart dropped into his stomach. The wood was screaming. At 2 a.m., the first catastrophic failure occurred. The Crest Haven Community Center, a sprawling log structure with a wide, flat roof that the town used for town hall meetings and winter dances, couldn't take the load. Over 70 tons of wet snow had accumulated on its surface, with a sound that reverberated through the valley even over the howling wind. The primary support trusses sheared in half. The entire roof collapsed inward, pancaking the building into a pile of crushed timber and shattered glass. Abigail felt the vibration of the collapse through the bedrock. She set her coffee down. The catastrophe had begun. Daybreak brought no light, only a shifting of the darkness from pitch black to a suffocating milky gray. The storm showed no signs of relenting. If anything, it had intensified. Abigail checked her external cameras, which were encased in heated, heavy-duty housing beneath the overhang of the stone shield. The feed on her monitor showed a white void. The snow was blowing completely sideways, a blinding tempest that made it impossible to see past her porch railing. She checked her manual measuring stake in the sheltered lee of the cabin. 6.5 feet in 14 hours. Above her, the stone shield groaned. It was a deep, guttural sound of steel under immense tension. Abigail felt a spike of adrenaline. The structure was currently holding roughly 150 tons of snow and ice. The river rocks inside the gabion baskets shifted slightly under the pressure, grinding against each other with a sound like grinding teeth. She walked over to the exposed steel I-beam that ran through the center of her living room, the primary anchor for the shield above. She placed her bare hand against the freezing metal. She could feel a slight vibration, the transfer of kinetic energy from the wind and the dead load above. "Hold," she whispered to the steel. "You were built for this." Down in the valley, Cresthaven was descending into absolute nightmare. The roads were completely impassable, buried under drifts that reached 10 feet high. The local snowplows, assuming they even had drivers brave enough to start them, were useless against the cement-like wall of ice. The town was entirely cut off from the outside world. Cell service had vanished when the towers froze over. Panic was spreading faster than the cold. Thomas Miller sat in his freezing living room wrapped in 3 sleeping bags. His decorative stone fireplace, which he had insisted looked better than a functional wood stove, was sucking the heat out of the room rather than warming it. His roof was making a terrifying, rhythmic popping sound. Every time the wind gusted, the ceiling bowed inward by over an inch. Dust and drywall flakes were drifting down like indoor snow. He realized, with a sickening nod of pure terror, that his home, the home he had loudly proclaimed was perfectly safe, was a death trap. At 10 a.m., the Sloan house gave way. Henry Sloan, his wife, and his 2 teenage boys had barely made it to the reinforced basement when the main load-bearing beam of their roof snapped like a dry twig. The resulting collapse sounded like an explosion. Tons of snow-shattered wood and shingles crashed into the living space, destroying the upper floor completely and burying the basement door under tons of debris. They were trapped underground, freezing in absolute darkness. Throughout the day, the horrific sound of structural failure echoed across the valley. Crack, boom. Another cabin flattened. Snap, crash. Another family scrambling into a crawl space, praying the floor joists above them would hold. The picturesque town of Cresthaven was being systematically crushed by the sky. By late afternoon of the second day, the snow depth reached an unfathomable 9 feet. Inside her bunker, Abigail was maintaining a strict routine. She kept the wood stove burning at an optimal temperature, checked the generator fuel levels, and monitored the structural integrity of the steel beams. The stone shield was bowing slightly, exactly as she had engineered it to do. It was flexing, distributing the impossible weight down through the exterior steel pylons and into the granite bedrock. It wasn't rigid. It was alive, fighting back against the mountain. She was eating a bowl of hot soup when the motion alarm at her front door went off. Abigail froze her spoon halfway to her mouth. The alarm system was triggered by an infrared tripwire located on the sheltered porch, meaning something had made it past the 10-foot snowdrifts and the hurricane winds. She moved quickly, grabbing a heavy steel crowbar from beside the door. She checked the camera feed. The lens was partially obscured by ice, but she could make out a dark, shapeless lump huddled against her reinforced storm door. It wasn't a bear. It was a person. Abigail didn't hesitate. She threw the heavy deadbolts, grabbed the handle, and pulled. The wind immediately tried to tear the door from its hinges, but she braced her shoulder against it, opening it just enough to reach out. A figure fell inward, collapsing onto the hardwood floor of her entryway in a flurry of snow and ice. Abigail slammed the door shut and locked it, cutting off the deafening roar of the storm. She knelt beside the figure. It was a man encased in a frozen parka, his face covered in a thick layer of ice, his lips blue and cracked. He was shivering so violently it looked like he was having a seizure. She pulled the icy hood back. It was Thomas Miller, the man who had organized the petition against her, the man who had called her a crazy, paranoid old woman. His eyes fluttered open, wild and unfocused. He looked up at Abigail, then up at the solid, unmoving ceiling of her cabin. He could hear the storm raging outside, but inside it was warm, quiet, and safe. He reached out with a trembling, frost-bitten hand and grabbed Abigail's sleeve. My roof." Miller stammered, his voice a broken, hoarse whisper. "It's gone. Everything's gone. The whole town." He choked on a sob, burying his face in his hands. "We were so wrong. Please, you have to help them." Abigail looked down at the broken man on her floor, then listened to the massive, terrifying weight of the blizzard grinding against the stone shield above them. The town had laughed at her. They had treated her like an outcast, and now she was the only one who could save them. "Drink this," Abigail said softly, handing him a thermos of hot tea. She stood up, walking toward her supply closet. She pulled out a heavy-duty climbing harness, 100 feet of static rope, and an avalanche beacon. "How many are trapped?" Abigail did not waste time offering Thomas Miller false comfort. The situation was far past the point of gentle reassurances. She pulled a thermal emergency blanket from a storage bin and wrapped it tightly around his shuddering shoulders, then handed him a pair of thick neoprene-lined mountaineering gloves. "Tcha. Drink the tea." "Thomas," Abigail ordered, her voice cutting through the dull roar of the storm pounding against the roof. "We have about 20 minutes before your core temperature drops to a critical level. You need calories and you need to give me coordinates. Who is trapped and where exactly were they when you left?" Miller's teeth chattered violently against the rim of the thermos. Henry Sloane's place. I heard the crash from my porch. It sounded like an artillery shell. His whole second floor just pancaked. Sarah and the boys were with him. And Margaret Cole's roof was bowing when I checked my radio. She lives at the bottom of the dip on Pine Ridge Road. The snow drifts there. Abigail, they have to be 20 feet high by now." Abigail mentally mapped the valley. Henry's custom-built lodge was a half-mile down the mountain, and Margaret's cottage was another quarter-mile past, that situated in a natural depression that would act like a bowl for the wind-driven snow. It was a logistical nightmare. She strapped on a heavily insulated chest rig, clipping 3 high-lumen tactical flashlights to the webbing, along with a folding avalanche shovel, heavy-duty wire cutters, and a medical trauma kit. She stepped into a pair of aggressive aluminum-framed snowshoes designed for deep backcountry ascents. "Faye, I'm going to tether us together," Abigail said, uncoiling the 100-foot static climbing rope. She attached a locking carabiner to her harness and handed the other end to Miller. "If you fall, I catch you. If I fall, you anchor me. Do not unclip. The visibility out there is 0. If we get separated by more than 10 feet, we will never find each other." Miller stared at the rope, then up at the 62-year-old woman he had openly mocked just weeks prior. "Abigail, you don't have to do this. It's a suicide mission. The wind, it's throwing whole trees around." "I calculated the sheer force of this storm 3 months ago," Thomas, Abigail said coldly, racking a heavy steel ice axe onto her pack. "I know exactly what's out there. Stand up." Opening the reinforced storm door took the combined strength of both of them. The moment the seal broke, a vacuum of negative pressure tried to suck them out into the void, followed instantly by a wall of blinding white ice that hit them like a physical blow. The temperature gauge on the porch read 22 degrees below 0, but with the wind chill factored in, it was closer to -60. Exposed skin would freeze solid in less than 4 minutes. They stepped off the protected porch and were immediately swallowed by the blizzard. The descent was agonizing. What was normally a 10-minute walk down a scenic logging road became a brutal inch-by-inch crawl through an alien landscape. The snow was chest-high in places, packed so densely by the hurricane-force winds that Abigail had to use her ice axe to hack a trench for them to walk through. The wind howled with a deafening, continuous shriek, ripping the breath from their lungs. Every step required a monumental expenditure of calories. Abigail took the lead, breaking the trail, her muscles burning under the heavy cement-like snow. Miller stumbled behind her, the static rope constantly snapping taut as he lost his footing. It took them an hour and a half to cover the half-mile to the Sloan property, or at least where the property used to be. Abigail stopped, shining her high lumen beam into the swirling vortex of white. There was no house. There was only a massive, unnatural mound of snow-jagged splinters of framing timber and shredded asphalt shingles protruding like broken bones from the drift. The sheer weight of the Sierra cement snow had snapped the primary ridge beam, collapsing the entire A-frame inward. "Henry Frey!" Miller screamed, his voice instantly snatched away by the wind. Abigail swept her light over the wreckage, her engineer's mind instantly calculating the trajectory of the collapse. The roof had fallen inward and slid slightly to the south, meaning the northern foundation wall might still have a pocket of intact space. "The basement access!" Abigail shouted, pulling Miller toward the north side of the debris field. "Dig!" They unholstered their folding shovels and attacked the snow. They dug with desperate, frantic energy, throwing aside heavy blocks of ice and shattered 2x4s. After 20 minutes of agonizing labor, Abigail's shovel struck metal. It was the exterior bulkhead door leading to the Sloanes' basement. It was bowed inward, crushed under the weight of a fallen structural beam. Abigail wedged her steel crowbar into the gap between the frozen metal doors and heaved with all her remaining strength. The steel groaned, slipping on the ice. "Help me!" she yelled. Miller grabbed the bar, pressing his weight against hers. With a sickening screech of tearing metal, the hinges gave way and the heavy door flipped backward. A rush of warm, foul-smelling air vented up from the darkness below. Abigail shone her flashlight down the concrete stairs. Huddled in the corner of the flooded, freezing basement, surrounded by burst pipes and shattered floor joists, hanging by mere threads, were Henry Sloane, his wife Sarah, and their 2 teenage boys. They were covered in drywall dust and shivering violently, staring up at the beam of light like it was an apparition. Henry, the contractor who had drawn crude cartoons of Abigail's cabin on diner napkins, looked up at her. His right arm hung at a sickening angle, clearly broken, and his face was bruised and streaked with blood. "Abigail." Henry croaked disbelief, masking the pain in his voice. "How? Your roof." "My roof is holding Henry." Abigail said, her voice completely devoid of vindication, strictly professional. "We need to move. Those floor joists above you have sheared. The only thing keeping the rest of the house from crushing you is a friction lock, and it's going to give the second the wind shifts. Let's go." Getting the Sloanes out of the basement was a masterclass in controlled panic. Henry was in no condition to climb, nearly passing out from the pain of his fractured arm. Abigail quickly improvised a splint, using a shattered piece of oak baseboard and a roll of heavy athletic tape from her trauma kit. "Sarah, tie this line around the boys," Abigail instructed, tossing a length of parachute cord down the stairs. "Thomas, you take the rear. Nobody stops moving. If you stop moving, you freeze." They formed a pathetic, desperate chain, 6 people tethered together in the heart of a bomb cyclone. The moment they crested the basement stairs and stepped back into the blizzard, the sheer violence of the storm nearly threw the teenage boys off their feet. The temperature had dropped again. The air was so cold, it felt like inhaling broken glass. "We have to go to Margaret's," Miller shouted, leaning close to Abigail's ear to be heard over the roaring wind. "She's alone." Abigail checked her compass, shielding the dial with her gloved hand. Navigating by sight was impossible. The world was a featureless gray void. "It's a quarter-mile down Pine Ridge. It's going to be a trench. The snow will be over our heads." "We can't leave her," Henry gasped, leaning heavily against his wife. "I have no intention of leaving her," Abigail replied. "Follow my tracks. Step exactly where I step." The trek to Margaret Cole's house was a descent into a freezing hell. The natural depression of the road had indeed acted as a catch basin for the wind-driven snow. The drifts were easily 15 feet high, forming sheer walls of white on either side of the road. They weren't walking on the ground anymore. They were walking on a compressed layer of ice suspended 10 feet above the asphalt. Suddenly, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a deep, resonant crack that vibrated through the soles of their boots. "Avalanche!" Miller screamed in terror. "No!" Abigail yelled back, sweeping her flashlight ahead. "Structural failure." They reached the coordinates of Margaret's property. The situation was worse than the Sloanes'. Margaret lived in a single-story, flat-roofed ranch. The design was utterly incapable of shedding snow. The entire structure had imploded. The roof lay flat against the foundation, having crushed the exterior walls outward like a stepped-on cardboard box. There was no basement. Margaret, Sarah Sloane, shrieked, falling to her knees in the snow. Abigail systematically scanned the perimeter of the flattened house. "Quiet," she commanded. "Listen." The group fell silent, the wind battering their bodies. Faintly beneath the howling gale and the shifting of the ice, they heard a rhythmic, muffled tapping. Tap, tap, tap. "The kitchen," Abigail said, orienting herself to the original floor plan. She had solid oak cabinets and a cast iron stove. It might have created a triangular void when the ceiling came down. They attacked the snow and debris with a frantic animalistic desperation. The cold was seeping through their layers, slowing their movements, making their joints ache with a deep throbbing pain. Abigail used the ice axe to chop through the frozen layers of asphalt shingles, while Miller and the Sloan boys dug out the loose snow. After 30 minutes of grueling labor, Abigail managed to pry back a section of the ruined ceiling, revealing a narrow pitch-black cavity. "Margaret," Abigail called out into the darkness. "Help!" A tiny, raspy voice echoed back. "Please." Abigail wedged her shoulders through the splintered wood, dropping down into the small, freezing pocket of air. Margaret Cole was pinned on the floor, the massive cast-iron kitchen stove having arrested the fall of the main support beam just inches from her head. She was trapped by a tangle of electrical wire and shattered drywall, shivering so violently her teeth were cracking. "Abigail," Margaret whispered, squinting against the beam of the flashlight. The woman who had petitioned the town to condemn Abigail's cabin looked at her savior with wide, terrified eyes. "I'm so cold, I can't feel my legs." "You're in shock, Margaret. We're going to get you out," Abigail said, pulling a pair of heavy wire cutters from her rig to sever the electrical cables wrapping the woman's ankles. "I need you to brace yourself. This is going to hurt." With Miller pulling from above and Abigail pushing from below, they managed to drag the elderly woman out of the wreckage just as a massive gust of wind hit the valley. The shift in pressure caused the debris field to settle dramatically. The cast-iron stove shifted, and the triangular void Abigail had just occupied collapsed with a sickening crunch, filling with solid ice and splintered wood. Abigail pulled herself out of the snow hole, her heart hammering against her ribs. They had made it by seconds. "We have to move," Abigail yelled, checking her altimeter watch. "The barometric pressure is still dropping. The worst of the storm is hitting now. If we don't start climbing, we die right here." The ascent back to Abigail's cabin was the single most demanding physical trial any of them had ever endured. They were hauling a severely injured man and a hypothermic, non-ambulatory elderly woman up a 45-degree incline in the middle of a historic bomb cyclone. Abigail fashioned a makeshift sled out of a section of Margaret's torn roof, flashing securing the woman to it with the parachute cord. Thomas Miller and the two teenage boys pulled the sled, while Abigail and Sarah supported Henry. The wind was now a physical barrier pushing against them with the force of a solid wall. The temperature had plunged to -35. The snow was falling so densely it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Every 100 yards they had to stop huddled together to block the wind and manually clear the ice, freezing over their eyes and nostrils. "I can't," Henry gasped, collapsing into the snow, his face gray and drawn. "Leave me. Take Sarah and the boys. I'm slowing you down." Abigail grabbed the collar of his jacket and hauled him upward with a sudden violent surge of adrenaline. "I did not spend the last 5 hours freezing my blood to let you quit on my mountain." "Henry, you get up. You get up and you walk, or I will drag you by your broken arm. Move." Her fury, raw and unyielding, shocked Henry back into motion. They crawled, stumbled, and dragged themselves up the final incline. And then through the impenetrable wall of white, a faint amber glow appeared. It was the exterior porch light of Abigail's cabin, powered by her diesel generator. Above the light, casting a massive, unyielding shadow against the storm, was the stone shield. It was a terrifying, beautiful sight. The structure was currently bearing over 300 tons of frozen water. The thick steel pylons hummed and vibrated under the incredible tension, but the angled carapace of riverstone and steel mesh was holding. The snow was stacking up on top, but the pitch of the shield was forcing the majority of the weight to shear off and avalanche harmlessly away from the actual cabin beneath. They staggered onto the sheltered porch, collapsing onto the hardwood deck. The sudden absence of the wind was a profound, shocking relief. Abigail threw open the heavy oak door and herded the survivors inside. The transition from the -30-degree blizzard to the 70-degree living room hit them like a physical wave. The air smelled of seasoned oak wood smoke and brewing coffee. The lights were steady and bright. It was a fortress of warmth in a valley of death. As Abigail locked the deadbolts, shutting out the roar of the apocalypse outside, the survivors collapsed onto the floor, weeping openly. For the next 4 hours, Abigail transformed from a structural engineer into a field medic. She built up the fire in the high-efficiency stove, boiling pots of water to create a humid microclimate in the living room to help thaw their frozen lungs. She carefully removed Margaret's frozen boots, treating her severely frostbitten toes with warm water immersion and sterile dressings. She reset Henry's broken arm using a proper fiberglass splint from her extensive medical cache, ignoring his groans of pain. She fed them dense calorie-rich stew, forced them to drink liters of warm fluids, and wrapped them in military-grade thermal sleeping bags. As the exhaustion finally began to overtake the panic, an awkward, heavy silence settled over the room. The wind continued to scream outside, shaking the massive steel frame above them, but the cabin itself was entirely secure. Thomas Miller sat by the stove, a mug of broth shaking in his hands. He looked around the cabin at the reinforced shutters, the massive battery bank, the stocked pantry, and finally at the exposed steel I-beam running through the ceiling, the anchor of the stone shield. He looked at Abigail, who was quietly reorganizing her trauma kit. "You knew," Miller said, his voice thick with shame. "You tried to warn us. You told me the math, and I laughed in your face. We all did. Pride is a terrible insulator." "Thomas," Abigail said quietly, not looking up from her work. "People tend to believe that nature cares about their traditions. It doesn't. A 2x10 wooden rafter can hold exactly what the laws of physics dictate it can hold, not an ounce more. You didn't want to see an ugly roof, so you chose to ignore the changing climate. I signed a petition to have this place condemned," Margaret whispered from her cot, tears streaking her dirt-caked face. "I called you crazy, and my house, my beautiful house, is just gone." "Structures can be rebuilt," Abigail said finally, looking up at the group of broken, humbled people. "But only if you survive the night." Suddenly, a massive, deafening crack echoed from above, followed by a terrifying shudder that vibrated through the floorboards. The entire cabin shook violently. Sarah Sloane screamed, pulling her boys close. Henry scrambled backward. "It's failing!" Miller shouted, staring up at the ceiling in terror. Abigail stood perfectly still, her hand resting against the central steel I-beam. She closed her eyes, feeling the vibration, listening to the high-pitched hum of the metal. Outside a massive century-old lodgepole pine, its roots finally giving way under the weight of the ice, had snapped and crashed directly onto the stone shield. The sound of grinding rocks and groaning steel filled the room. The tension was agonizing. Then the vibration stopped. The hum of the steel settled back into a low, steady frequency. The shield had taken a direct hit from a multi-ton falling tree, and it hadn't yielded an inch. Abigail opened her eyes and looked at Miller. "No," Abigail said, a faint, grim smile touching the corners of her mouth. "It's holding." For the next 5 days, the bomb cyclone raged, burying Cresthaven under an unprecedented 14 feet of snow. But inside the bunker beneath the stone shield, the fire burned bright, the generator hummed, and the survivors lived. They had walked into the storm as arrogant neighbors, but they survived it as witnesses to a profound, undeniable truth. When the sky falls, you better be standing under something built by someone who respected the math. By the morning of the 3rd day, the howling of the wind outside had ceased, replaced by something far more terrifying, an absolute suffocating silence. The bomb cyclone had finally exhausted its energy, moving eastward across the plains, but it had left behind a transformed world. Inside Abigail Foster's cabin, the concept of day and night had completely lost its meaning. The triple-paned windows, protected by the heavy storm shutters, were completely useless. The cabin was entombed. 14 feet of dense, heavy snow had completely swallowed the structure. The stone shield had done its job, bearing the brunt of the weight and forcing the accumulation to slide down its angled flanks, but in doing so, it had created a massive, compacted berm of ice that sealed the cabin from the outside world. They were essentially living in a submarine, buried at the bottom of a frozen ocean. The psychological toll of the isolation began to set in immediately. Henry Sloane, his arm throbbing beneath the fiberglass splint, stared blankly at the wood-paneled wall, mourning the total loss of the home he had built with his own 2 hands. His wife, Sarah, kept her teenage sons, Liam and Noah, close to the wood stove, rationing out their shared body heat. Margaret Cole, the elderly woman they had pulled from the crushed ruins of her kitchen, drifted in and out of a feverish sleep on a cot, her frostbitten toes elevated and bandaged. Abigail did not allow herself the luxury of despair. She operated on the cold, hard logic of a structural engineer managing a failing system. She had established a strict rationing protocol for the food, the firewood, and most importantly, the electrical power. "We have a problem," Abigail announced quietly to Thomas Miller, pulling him aside into the small galley kitchen so the others wouldn't hear. Miller, the former hardware store owner who had once mocked her, now looked at Abigail with a deferential, almost desperate respect. The arrogance had been completely scoured from him by the storm. "What is it?" "The roof," he asked, his eyes darting upward to the heavy steel I-beam. "No, the shield is holding," Abigail replied, keeping her voice low. "It's the generator. The main 1,000-gallon diesel tank is buried 10 feet underground, which usually keeps it well below the frost line. But the ground temperature has plummeted so drastically because of the ice pack that the diesel in the secondary feed line is beginning to gel." Miller's face went pale. He knew enough about mechanics to understand the death sentence that implied. Diesel fuel contains paraffin wax. When temperatures drop low enough that wax crystallizes, turning the liquid fuel into a thick, useless jelly that clogs fuel filters and suffocates engines. "I put an anti-gel additive in the main tank back in October," Abigail explained, grabbing a heavy canvas tool bag from under the sink. "But the fuel sitting in the exposed junction pipe between the tank and the generator shed is freezing. The engine has sputtered twice in the last hour. If it dies, the block will freeze solid in less than 30 minutes. We lose our lights, our electric hot plate, and our ability to melt snow for drinking water. The wood stove alone isn't enough to keep 6 people alive in a buried, uninsulated box for a week." "What do we do?" Miller asked, rolling up his sleeves, ready to follow her lead. "We go into the crawl space," she said. The crawl space beneath the cabin was accessible through a heavy trapdoor in the pantry floor. It was a dark, cramped nightmare of a space barely 3 feet high, crisscrossed with plumbing pipes and heavy electrical conduit. The temperature down there was hovering just above 0. Abigail and Miller squeezed into the freezing darkness armed with 2 industrial heat guns, a heavy-duty extension cord, and rolls of reflective thermal insulation. They had to belly crawl 30 feet through the dirt and ice to reach the exterior wall where the fuel line entered the structure. "Here," Abigail whispered, her breath pluming in the beam of her headlamp. She pointed to a thick black rubber hose encased in a braided steel sleeve. It was coated in a thick layer of white frost. "Feel it." Miller reached out. The line was rigid, completely solid. "It's a brick, Abigail. The fuel isn't flowing." "Plug in the heat guns," she ordered. For the next 2 hours, they engaged in a painstaking, desperate battle against the cold. They lay on their backs in the freezing dirt, holding the high-wattage heat guns, inches from the steel-braided line, slowly working the intense heat back and forth. It was agonizing work. Their shoulders cramped, their fingers went numb, and the claustrophobia of the tight space threatened to induce a panic attack. Above them, the generator suddenly coughed. The rhythmic, steady thrumming of the diesel engine broke into a ragged, choking sputter. "It's starving!" Miller yelled over the noise, pressing his heat gun closer to the brass, fitting near the wall. Come on! Don't melt the rubber casing!" Abigail warned, her own hands shaking from the cold. "Keep it moving." The generator gave one final violent shudder, and the sound died completely. Instantly, the faint hum of electricity in the floorboards vanished. They were plunged into total silence, save for their own ragged breathing. "No," Miller whispered, dropping his head into the dirt. "We don't quit, Thomas." Abigail snapped, her voice cracking like a whip in the dark. "The wax just hit the inline filter. The engine is still warm. If we can get liquid fuel flowing in the next 10 minutes, I can restart it. Keep heating the line. I'm going up to bleed the fuel injector." Abigail scrambled backward through the crawl space with a speed that belied her 62 years. She burst through the trap door into a cabin that was now illuminated only by the flickering orange glow of the wood stove. The others were sitting in terrified silence. "Nobody panic!" Abigail commanded, grabbing a wrench set. She threw open the heavy steel door that led to the attached generator shed. The cold hit her like a physical blow. She ripped the cowling off the massive diesel engine, located the primary fuel filter, and cracked the bleeder valve. A thick, cloudy paste oozed out. "Thomas, heat the line directly beneath the floorboard," she screamed down the hatch. She grabbed a propane blowtorch from her workbench. It was incredibly dangerous to use an open flame near a fuel source, but the safety margins had vanished hours ago. She carefully played the blue flame over the heavy cast-iron fuel pump, warming the metal, melting the crystallized wax inside the lines. "Try the primer bulb," Miller shouted from below. Abigail pumped the rubber bulb on the side of the engine. It was stiff, resisting her pressure. She pushed harder, her knuckles turning white. Suddenly, the bulb compressed and a thin stream of clear liquid amber diesel spurted from the bleeder valve. "Got it!" she yelled, tightening the valve shut with a wrench. She reached for the ignition switch, praying the battery had enough cold-cranking amps left. She turned the key. The starter motor whined a sluggish, heavy sound. "Come on," Abigail whispered. She turned the key again. The engine coughed a cloud of black smoke, and roared back to life. The overhead lights flickered and then burned a steady, brilliant white. A collective cheer echoed from the living room. Abigail leaned against the vibrating metal casing of the generator, closing her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs. They had bought themselves another day. The relief of saving the generator was short-lived. By the evening of the fourth day, a new, far more insidious threat began to creep into the cabin. It didn't arrive with the roaring violence of the wind or the crushing weight of the snow. It arrived in absolute silence. It started with Liam, the younger of the two Sloan boys. He complained of a severe throbbing headache behind his eyes. An hour later, his mother Sarah began to feel severely nauseous, leaning over a bucket and dry heaving. Margaret Cole, already weak, became dangerously lethargic, her speech slurring as she tried to ask for water. Abigail was at the kitchen counter calculating their caloric intake for the next week when a sharp, piercing electronic shriek shattered the quiet of the cabin. Beep, 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 beep. It was the carbon monoxide detector mounted on the wall near the ceiling. Abigail dropped her pencil, her blood running cold. She rushed to the digital display on the unit. The screen read 150 ppm parts per million. Anything over 70 ppm was dangerous. At 150, sustained exposure would lead to unconsciousness and eventually death. "Everyone stay low to the floor," Abigail barked, grabbing a damp towel and holding it over her nose and mouth. "Carbon monoxide is slightly lighter than air. It pools at the ceiling first. Get down." "What's happening?" Henry asked, sliding off his chair onto the hardwood floor, pulling his sons down with him. "But the snow," Abigail said grimly, looking toward the ceiling. "We're buried too deep. The exhaust pipe for the diesel generator and the chimney flue for the wood stove run up through the stone shield, but the snowpack must have drifted over the clearance stacks. The exhaust has nowhere to go. It's backing up into the cabin." She ran to the generator shed and slammed the heavy kill switch. The engine died instantly, plunging them into sudden darkness, save for the emergency battery-operated LED lanterns that automatically clicked on. She then sprinted to the wood stove, grabbing a heavy iron bucket of ash and dumping it directly onto the burning logs, suffocating the fire. Smoke immediately billowed into the room. "We just lost our heat and our power," Miller said, his voice trembling in the dark. If I didn't shut them down, we would all be dead in our sleep in 2 hours," Abigail replied, coughing as the smoke cleared. "But we have a massive problem. This cabin is airtight by design to retain heat. Without ventilation, the oxygen levels will drop, and the CO2 from our own breathing will poison us. We need to breach the surface. We need a vent hole." She unrolled a set of blueprints on the floor, shining a lantern over the schematics. "The peak of the stone shield is 22 feet above our floor level. The snow above that is at least another 8 feet deep. We have to dig a vertical shaft straight up from the front porch." "Dig up?" Noah, the older teenage boy, asked in disbelief. "How the snow will just collapse on us." "We use the gabion baskets," Abigail explained, pointing to the structural drawing. "The shield is made of heavy-gauge wire mesh. We cut a hole in the mesh, remove the river stones, and use the steel frame as a structural support to dig a chimney through the snowpack. We shore it up as we go." It was a terrifying, desperate plan. Digging a vertical tunnel through uncompacted snow from the bottom up was an invitation for a fatal avalanche. But the air in the cabin was already growing stale, heavy with the metallic sweet smell of trapped exhaust. They had no choice. Abigail Thomas Miller and the 2 Sloan boys geared up. They stepped onto the enclosed front porch, which was pitch black and freezing. Abigail used a battery-powered angle grinder to cut a 3-foot square through the heavy steel mesh of the inner roof above the porch. River rocks immediately poured down, clattering onto the deck. Once the stones were cleared, they were looking up at a solid white ceiling of compacted Sierra cement snow. "I'll go first," Thomas Miller said, grabbing the folding avalanche shovel. "No," Noah Sloan stepped forward. The 16-year-old was tall, broad-shouldered, and fueled by a desperate need to save his parents. "I'm lighter. I fit in the hole better. Let me do it." Abigail looked at the boy, recognizing the grim determination in his eyes. She handed him the shovel and a heavy plastic bucket tied to a length of parachute cord. "You dig exactly straight up. Do not widen the shaft, or you'll compromise the structural integrity of the snow bridge. Fill the bucket, drop it down, and we empty it. If you hear a cracking sound, you drop instantly." Noah nodded, pulling his goggles down. He climbed onto a sturdy stepladder, hoisting his upper body through the hole in the steel mesh, and began to dig. It was a grueling, agonizing process. Noah hacked at the concrete-like snow above his head, the icy debris falling directly onto his face and shoulders. He filled the bucket, lowered it, and Miller dumped the snow over the porch railing. Inch by inch, foot by foot, Noah carved a chimney into the darkness. After 2 hours, Noah was completely exhausted, his arms trembling. His brother Liam took over, then Miller. They rotated a desperate assembly line, fighting against the suffocating air inside the cabin. The air was getting dangerously thin. Abigail found herself panting, her head spinning with a dull ache. She checked her watch. It had been 4 hours since the generator was shut off. The temperature inside the cabin had plummeted to 30 degrees. Margaret was non-responsive. I can't reach the top," Liam gasped from inside the tunnel, his voice muffled by the snow. "The shovel handle is too short. I'm hitting a layer of solid ice." "It's the crust," Abigail yelled up to him. The wind glazed the top layer of the snowpack. "You have to break through it, Liam. Hit it with the edge of the blade." "I can't get any leverage," the boy cried out. Abigail grabbed her heavy steel ice axe. "Come down," she ordered. Liam scrambled down, collapsing onto the porch, gasping for the stale air. Abigail climbed the ladder, squeezing her shoulders into the narrow, freezing shaft. The ice walls pressed in on her, inducing a wave of severe claustrophobia. She climbed up the footholds the boys had kicked into the snow walls until her head bumped against a solid, unyielding layer of dark ice. She gripped the ice axe with both hands, ignoring the burning ache in her shoulders, and swung upward with all her remaining strength. The steel pick bit deep into the ice. She ripped it free and swung again. Crack! She swung a third time, screaming in exertion. The ice shattered. A blast of agonizingly bright, pure sunlight poured down through the hole, hitting Abigail like a physical force. She squeezed her eyes shut, blinded by the sudden radiance after days in the dark. The rush of fresh, freezing, oxygen-rich mountain air immediately flooded the shaft, tasting sweeter than anything she had ever experienced. "We're through!" she screamed down the tunnel, her voice cracking with emotion. "We have a vent!" Cheers erupted from the porch below. Abigail widened the hole with the axe, making it large enough to safely vent the exhaust stacks. As she cleared the last of the ice away, she hoisted herself up until her head and shoulders broke the surface of the snowpack. When her eyes finally adjusted to the glare, she froze, completely stunned by the view. The town of Cresthaven was gone. The valley she had looked out over for months no longer existed. It had been replaced by a completely alien landscape of rolling, pure white dunes. The towering lodgepole pines were buried up to their topmost branches. There were no roads, no power lines, no landmarks. And there were no houses. Every single cabin in the valley, from Henry Sloane's sprawling lodge to Thomas Miller's modern A-frame, had been completely erased, crushed flat, and buried under 14 feet of snow. Her home, protected beneath the bizarre, ugly, heavily engineered stone shield, was the only structure that had maintained an air pocket. The shield itself was entirely invisible, buried beneath the snow, but its presence had kept the crushing weight off the wooden cabin below. "Abigail," Miller's voice echoed up from the shaft. "What do you see?" "Nothing, Thomas," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "There is absolutely nothing left." She climbed back down the shaft, re-entering the freezing cabin. The fresh air had already begun to clear the carbon monoxide. She immediately went to the generator shed and fired the engine back up. The lights flickered on, and within 20 minutes, the wood stove was roaring again, pushing back the deadly cold. For the next 2 days, they lived in a strange, suspended state of survival. The air was breathable, the heat was stable, but they knew they were entirely cut off from the world. Abigail took the brightest orange emergency thermal blankets she had climbed the snow shaft and staked them to the surface of the snowpack, creating a massive high-visibility cross. It was their only hope of being found in the endless sea of white. On the morning of the 7th day, a sound vibrated through the snow above them. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, distinct from the howl of the wind. Thwump, 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 thwump. "Helicopters!" Henry Sloane gasped, sitting up from his cot. Abigail didn't hesitate. She grabbed a flare gun from her emergency kit, scrambled up the ladder, and pushed herself out of the ventilation shaft onto the glaring white surface. 2 massive dark green UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters belonging to the Colorado National Guard were sweeping low over the valley, their rotors kicking up massive clouds of powder. They were flying a search and rescue grid, looking for survivors in a town they presumed was a total loss. Abigail raised the heavy flare gun and pulled the trigger. A streak of brilliant red phosphorus shot into the blue sky, exploding with a loud pop. The lead Black Hawk immediately banked hard, its nose dipping as the pilot spotted the red smoke, and the orange thermal blankets spread across the snow. The massive machine hovered 50 feet above the ground, the downdraft nearly knocking Abigail off her feet. A side door slid open, and a rescue swimmer in high-visibility gear leaned out, staring in absolute disbelief at the 62-year-old woman standing alone in a wasteland of ice. It took the National Guard team 2 hours to dig a safe extraction ramp down to the cabin's front porch. When the first rescuer, a burly medic named Captain Reynolds, stepped through the heavy oak door into the warm, brightly lit living room, he stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the glowing wood stove, the humming lights, the meticulously organized medical station, and the 5 survivors huddled together in thermal blankets. Then he looked at Abigail Foster. "Ma'am," Captain Reynolds said, his voice thick with shock. "Command told us this entire grid was a mass casualty zone. We've flown over 40 flattened foundations this morning. How in God's name is this building still standing?" Before Abigail could answer, a second figure stepped through the door behind the medic. It was Alfred Davies, the Weary County building inspector who had reviewed her blueprints months ago. He looked at the massive steel I-beam running through the ceiling, feeling the faint vibration of the stone shield holding up tons of ice above them. Davies took off his snow-crusted hat and looked at Abigail with profound reverence. "Hydrostatic pressure and dead load." "Captain," Davies said quietly, answering the medic's question. "She built a fortress for the end of the world, and the rest of the town laughed at her for it." Thomas Miller stood up, walking over to stand beside Abigail. He looked at the inspector, then at the rescue team. "We were fools," Miller said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had survived his own arrogance. "She tried to save us, and we treated her like a pariah. If it wasn't for this woman and this cabin, we'd all be buried at the bottom of the valley." When the rescue helicopters finally lifted off from the ruined valley of Cresthaven, they carried away 11 survivors, people who owed their lives entirely to the uncompromising mathematical brilliance of a woman they'd once dismissed as paranoid. The Great Whiteout of 2024 erased a town from the map, but it could not erase Abigail Foster's unyielding dedication to preparation. The stone shield stood as a monument to the simple, unforgiving truth. Nature does not care about our opinions, our traditions, or our pride. When the sky falls, only the prepared remain standing. Thank you so much for experiencing this incredible, true-to-life survival saga with us. If Abigail's incredible engineering, the terrifying reality of the bomb cyclone, and this harrowing tale of survival against all odds kept you glued to the screen, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and absolutely hit subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the most intense, real-life survival stories. Stay vigilant, stay prepared, and we'll see you next time.